Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have Dr. Beth Slutsky, who will be giving us an overview of the curriculum guides developed by Cal Humanities as a teaching resource for librarians, teachers, and educators participating in the California Reads program. Dr. Slutsky has a PhD in American History, is the program coordinator at the California History Social Science Project, and teaches classes at UC Davis. Dr. Slutsky also edited all of the lessons included in the California Reads program. Thanks for being here, Dr. Slutsky, and guiding us through the California Reads Curriculum Guide webinar.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. So what I wanted to do today is just provide a pretty big overview of what you're going to find in the curriculum guide, to explain the goals of what the curriculum guides are aiming to do, the intended audience, and then to lay one out for you today to sort of walk you through step by step, because I'm sure if you've taken a look at it, you've seen that they're a little bit, well, long to say the least, and I want to break it down just to show you that it's really not as intimidating as they might seem, but really very helpful. So, okay, so here's the goal in my introduction. Our goal in this project is really to make all of the California Reads useful to educators across the state and to make the California Reads accessible to K-12 students, because there's 5 amazing books that Californians are hopefully sharing and discussing this year, but the text and the ideas contained in the text is challenging for a lot of students to access. So one of the primary goals was to really select topics and excerpts from within the text that would be much more in line with what K-12 students are doing on a day-to-day basis. So what it is, I already said it, grade level appropriate lesson plans based on each book. How have we done it? Well, just in case you're curious, I teamed up scholars from around the state and teacher leaders from school districts in both Northern and Southern California. Teams of these people worked with me and others in my office to create lessons based on each book. The lessons are supposed to be anywhere between 3 and 5 days in length, and the lessons are completely cohesive. They're centered around broad investigative questions that aligns, like I said, excerpts from each of the text with the lessons, with California content standards, and also with Common Core state standards, which are going to be the new way for all teachers in California to align their curriculum. Okay, so let me just talk quickly through how the curriculum guides are organized. So there, as you've seen, I'm sure, there's one curriculum guide for each of the 5 books. So no matter which of the 5 books you're looking at, each of the guides is going to have each of these components. So in each guide, you'll find the lesson title and the authors, in case you're curious. You'll also find the historical investigation question that guides the student's learning and also guides the entire lesson. It's the link really between the text, the content, and the primary sources. In each curriculum guide, you'll also find an introduction that contains a little bit of background content information, but also pedagogical information to help educators, parents, librarians, anyone who wants to pick up a lesson and teach this to a child. It will give them a frame of reference. Each curriculum guide also contains standards alignment. In other words, it contains the content standards for the grade that the book properly aligns with. Now, this has been a little bit of a tricky process because the Constitution, for example, it's taught heavily in 5th, 8th, and also 12th grade. So what we've done is we've created a lesson that would be great for 5th and 8th graders with extensions for 12th grade. And I can walk you through a little bit later on the grade levels that go with each of the other lessons, but I'll come back to that. Okay, after that, we've spent a lot of time going step by step through each of the procedures so that the complete lesson is laid out in kind of a minute-by-minute and day-by-day format. So you'll see a chart at around the second or third page of each lesson that lays that out. You're also going to find activities that incorporate the California Reads books. So you'll find text excerpts and citations from the text, but you're also going to find ways that students can use academic literacy strategies to break down the text. For example, text from the Constitution is pretty unwieldy for a 5th grader, so we've included some vocabulary activities to help them interpret that. We've also included primary sources and analysis tools for each lesson to teach students about the raw material of the past. A big component of our work at the History Project is helping students learn to be historians through the historical investigative process. So all of our lessons center around primary sources. Now, oftentimes, the primary source is the California Read excerpt, like in the case of the Constitution, and really also in the case of Farewell to Manzanar, though we've included other primary sources in that lesson, like photographs and people's oral histories. But in each of the cases, we've included additional primary sources to help students really engage with the raw material of the past. We've also included in each of the curriculum guide an assignment that asks students to think historically, in other words, to help them interpret the text, to put it in its larger historical context, to engage in disciplinary skills that are specific to whatever text they're focusing on. Finally, we've included assessments. Now, these assessments vary from text to text because each of the text, again, aligns more or less with a certain grade level. So in the case of Lost City Radio and Farewell to Manzanar, which are both high school level texts, we've included writing assignments at the end, and I'll walk you through those in a minute. And then finally, each curriculum guide includes references, references that the scholars and the teachers used when they were putting it together, but also references for future reading. Okay, so what I want to do now is just walk you through one of the curriculum guides. I will not walk you through all of them because that would be a very long webinar. But this is, my screen went blank. Okay, there, I think it went back up. Okay, this Lost City Radio is, representative of all of the curriculum guides. So I'm going to walk you through how we put together the curriculum guide for this. And I'm not even going to walk you through every page of it. I'm just going to point to some highlights so that you can see the overall structure of it. Okay, so what you can see is the table of contents, which you'll find on the first page of every unit. And so like I just kind of went through all of the components of the curriculum guide, you'll find that repeated on the table of contents. The only thing that I want to point you to is underneath the procedures, we've tried to do a pretty good job of describing each of the handouts, and especially with Lost City Radio and a little bit with Paradise Built in Hell and Farewell to Manzanar, we wanted the educators to have a little bit more background for themselves. So we've included a historical background for educators piece just so they can kind of contextualize not just the California Read selection, but also the topic, because the topic can be challenging to teach. Okay, so then this is the real first page. This is what all of the first pages are going to look like. So this is the first page of the Lost City Radio curriculum guide. You can see right below the title of the book, we've put the title of the lesson in quotes, which is Peru Civil War. Right underneath that are the authors, Kristen Allen, an administrator at Twin Rivers Unified School District, north of Sacramento, which was also authored by Bethany Hopkins from UC Davis and myself. So you've seen the title, you've seen the authors, and then right below that you'll find the major topics. So these are sort of the quintessential topics that we aim to cover in the lesson. So the Civil War in Peru, left-wing movements in Latin America, and violence as a political strategy. So if you wanted to just pick this up and say, hand it to a teacher who walked into one of your discussions, you can say, this is a great lesson that aligns with Lost City Radio because it covers these three things. And then right below that, in the red box, is that historical investigation question that guides the entire lesson. So the historical investigation question for Lost City Radio is, how did Peru's Civil War, which we've sort of loosely defined as 1980 to 1992, affect the cause of democracy, individual freedom, and human rights in Peru? And how and why did Peruvians disagree about the causes of the conflict? So that's the big question that the entire lesson is going to center around. Right below that, you'll see that there's a couple of paragraphs that explain the context. It's, in a sense, it's the thesis statement for the lesson. Now, this isn't something that we recommend giving to students, but we kind of intend this to be an introduction for the educators themselves. So, for example, in this curriculum guide, students will learn about the origins, milestones, and aftermath of the Civil War in Peru between the far-left insurgent movements and the military-dominated Peruvian government. During these 12 years of fighting, 70,000 people died as a result of the conflict. Students in this unit will study the personal narratives of both participants and non-participants in the conflict. And then it goes on to sort of explain what students in general will be doing throughout this lesson. Now, it's not the step-by-step procedures. It's just the overview of what you're going to find. Okay, this next page is the second page of the lesson. This is the content standards. Like I mentioned before, we've aligned these lessons both with the California History Social Science content standards, but also the Common Core standards. So at the top, you'll see 10th grade standards. And for those of you that are completely unfamiliar with content standards, which I hope some of you are because, boy, they're sometimes challenging to understand, the 10th grade, you'll see the numbers next to them. So the standard that this aligns with is 10.10, but also below that, 10.10.1, 10.10.3. So if you have a teacher show up at your discussion, you can say to them, here's the standards that this book aligns with. So then this is taken straight from the California Department of Education. This is what they think 10th grade students should be doing here, and here's how this lesson actually does it. Underneath that is how the lesson aligns with the Common Core state standards. There are both reading standards and also writing standards. So the reading standard that it aligns with is that students should be determining the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source. They should also provide an accurate summary of how key events or ideas develop over the course of a text. And then they should be analyzing in detail a series of events. So these are sort of the disciplinary skills that students should be learning in grades 6 to 12, and this is a lesson in which they're doing all of those things. Okay, the next part is the procedures part. So this is where we're basically writing step-by-step instructions for how the unit, or for how this curriculum guide should be taught. Now, I want to make a couple of qualifications. This is how this unit we think should be taught if time is not a huge issue. So this lesson is, again, 3 to 5 days in length, and we've divided it by class periods, so each class period is, say, 50 minutes. So in a perfect world, if you could get through all of this, we really want you to. However, we know that teachers are always pressed for time. And so what we've done is that for each class period, we've intended that the activity can be standalone. In other words, you don't have to build off of the previous one. You can just pick up an activity and teach that rather than, devote an entire 5 days or nothing. Okay, so let me quickly go through this part 1 because there's a few different parts in the procedures. This is where students are basically introduced to the topic. In this case, this is how they're introduced to the Civil War in Peru, so this is where they're getting context, grasp of the issue. So in order to introduce this topic, we've created 3 different handouts, and you can see in parentheses handout 1, 2, and 3. This is background information for educators, Peruvian conflict historical summary, and then a timeline. And then beneath that, you'll see how you should do step-by-step instructions. So like I told you, the first class period, actually, the authors in this case said should be entirely optional. We think that students would really benefit from a short geography lesson, especially about Latin America, and we've suggested a way that teachers can do that. Beneath that, we have come up with the second handout, which I'll get to in a minute, where students are introduced to the various conflicts in Peru. Okay, then part 2 is where students really get into, in a sense, the meat of the topic. This is where students are going to look at primary source documents, they're going to analyze them, they're going to make themselves wrestle with this historical investigation question. So there's a few different resources that the authors of this lesson have come up with. The first thing that I should say about this is the teacher and the scholar both strongly recommend this documentary that teachers can get online for free at both of these links. The documentary is called People of the Shining Path. It's a long documentary, but they've taken great lengths to excerpt it. And so what they recommend then is showing below minutes from the People of the Shining Path and going through specific questions about the documentary, which they'll find in handout number 4. Okay, so the documentary to explain both the origins and the significance of the Civil War in Peru are an essential part of students understanding what's going on here. Okay, the next part, and again, even if you're not using this Lost City Radio book, the structure is the same in each of the lessons. Okay, so the next part is the analyzing images part. The images that the authors focused on here are propaganda posters because they were really powerful to people in the Shining Path. And so this step-by-step instruction focuses on how instructors should explain to students how to use propaganda in their classrooms, or how to analyze propaganda in their classrooms. And then finally, on the last day, students are turning to the actual text excerpts from Lost City Radio. Now, the authors of this lesson felt very strongly that students would need a lot of context to understand where the author was coming from and what the context should be for them understanding the Peruvian Civil War. So here we are at day 3, and students are going to actually get their hands into the text of Lost City Radio using handout number 7. And then the lesson suggests that students will either read the text excerpt silently or the instructor can summarize it, and that once they have read through the excerpts, they'll go through handout number 8, which I'll show you in a minute. It's a double entry journal, and analyze sections from the text. Okay, and then this is the final component. So students have been introduced to the topic, they've looked at this documentary, they've looked at primary sources, and they've also read excerpts from the text. So now the goal is for students to put it all together. And in this case, since this is a 10th grade lesson, the authors of the lesson said that it would be best for students to actually marshal this evidence and put it into an essay, which is in handout number 9, which I'll come back to. Okay, so now that we've gone through the procedures, I just wanted to quickly go through what the handouts look like. And I'm not going to go through all of the handouts, but I am just going to give you a sampling of them so that you can see that this is, intended to be as helpful as possible, but also it's intended to be standalone, so that if you only have time to say, look at these propaganda posters, that you can do that. But that in a perfect world, this does all fit together, and it revolves around this central unifying investigation question. Okay, so this first handout, which again, you'll see something like it in all of the lessons, it's historical background for educators. It was especially important in this book because teachers that we work with don't have a ton of background knowledge about the historical context in which this novel centered and around which the lesson rotates. So it's historical background both about Peru and the Civil War and just the different perspectives in the war. Okay, this is the third handout. So again, I'm jumping around here, but one of the interesting things about this is that based on something that the students are going to do, we've asked that they fill out a timeline, so that which we call Peruvian conflict, and we've said that students should put at least 8 significant events from Peru's history, and they'll get the significant events from handout number 2. So we've given them a handout that gives a lot of kind of complex background information. But we want to have a way so that students can actually digest it and, see how things changed over time over the past couple of centuries to try to lay this out. So we've suggested, starting with 1800 and then it goes all the way to the year 2010, what's going on here. So this is the student draft of it, and then what's coming next is the teacher part of it. So then this is the teacher key, where we've gone ahead and we've, suggested all of these significant events that students should get from the prior page. Okay, I'm jumping way forward here, but I want to highlight how the text is used in these lessons. I mentioned earlier that we've excerpted lots of text. This is just one of the pages. There's probably 6 or 7 pages where we've taken chunks of the text, and in this case, it's like a paragraph long, and we've given students some instructions. So now that they have this historical context about the background of the Peru Civil War, now that they've seen the documentary, now that they've looked at propaganda posters, we really want them to read the text and understand it in its own context. So we've said, respond in whatever way seems appropriate. So we've tried to have it be a little bit open-ended, and you can see this in the directions. So if something is literally puzzling to you, students can write that down. Write your opinion of what's happening. Reflect on the meaning of the quote. Relate it to your own life or real-world situations. But then we've also given a little bit more direction to say, in this case, respond to the loss of individual freedoms and human rights. Who's the character speaking to? So we're asking them to really grapple with the text on a number of levels. And given the fact that they've just had all this context for it, they can hopefully, think a little bit more critically about what's going on in the text. Because again, we don't think that 15-year-old students across the state have the opportunity and the resources to pick up the entire book and engage in a discussion. But this way, with, say, 6 pages of quotes, they can really pick it up and they can understand the context and they can engage with it at a really age-appropriate level that's very meaningful and very interesting. And then this is the essay prompt. I wanted to bring this up because this is the way that we're tying all of the different pieces together. So here we've included a little bit of background about the Civil War, and then at the bottom you can see the question that students are going to be writing an essay about. How did Peru Civil War affect the cause of democracy, individual freedom, and human rights in Peru? Based on your analysis, who do you find more responsible for the violence, the government, military, or the guerrilla insurgent groups, and why? So students are asked, in this case, to take a stand, in other words, using all of the evidence, all of the materials that they've been provided with over the course of this lesson, so looking at the historical background, looking at the timeline of events, looking at this documentary, looking at propaganda posters and some other primary sources, and also looking at the Lost City Radio text, come up with an argument about how Peru Civil War affected the cause of democracy. And that's the ultimate assignment that students will do in this lesson. Now, each lesson, as I said, contains a final assignment along these lines, but a final assignment that's more age appropriate for each lesson. So I think I said this earlier, that Farewell to Manzanar has an essay at the end, so does Paradise Built in Hell, and so does It Can't Happen Here. But they're each structured a little bit differently depending on grade level. And then finally, at the end, in case you're curious, each lesson comes with a biography of each of the presenters. And the reason I bring this up is that, these are real people, and if you have questions about the lessons, these educators spent a long time putting them together and would love to get feedback on them. So please feel free to get in touch with me to reach any of them, because they would love to hear, the feedback to them. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to talk about with the lessons. Now, again, I know there's a lot of pages in each of them, and I don't intend for you to print out copies to hand out at each of these discussion forums. That would be very wasteful. But hopefully, you can point educators to them on the CCH's website, and they can be useful to, anyone who wants to translate these texts to children across the state. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can to get the word out that these curriculum guides are really useful resources. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.